Kia ora koutou katoa, nau mai, haere mai ki tēnei hui, community climate conversations. What does climate change mean for us? Ko Lexi Seedhouse tōku ingoa. Thanks for joining us for this community conversation webinar. My name's Lexi, I'm the Engagement Manager at Wellington City Council and I'll be facilitating the discussion this evening. So I'll start with a karakia timatanga, whakatakataho. Whakatakataho ki te uru, whakatakataho ki te tonga, kia mā kina kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai, e hi ake ana, te atakura, hei tio, hei huka, hei hauhu, ti hei, mauri ora. So, before we begin, I'd like to first give an introduction of the content and the format of tonight's session. I'll introduce our speakers, and then I'll explain to you how you'll be able to participate in the session and ask us questions. The purpose of this session is to learn more about how climate change is affecting the capital and what you can do to make a difference. Our speakers are going to cover how climate change shows up in Wellington, both the causes and the impacts, what changes are happening, and what Wellingtonians can do to take action. So in addition to this, you'll have the opportunity to share your thoughts and ideas and to ask our panel questions. So without further ado, these are our speakers. So this is Pip Wheaton. She's our Principal Advisor on Climate Action. Pip's going to be speaking about the causes of climate change and localising it in the Wellington context. Kaeden Watts, our Principal Engagement Advisor for Climate Adaptation, is going to be speaking about the impacts of climate change in Te Whanganui-a-Tara and how we can adapt to them, as well as encompassing learnings from Te Ao Māori in our response to climate change. And Mark Noyes, who is our Community Team Leader for Connecting Communities. Mark's going to be closing off the presentation by talking about the incredible work already being led at the community level in Wellington, and sharing ideas about how people can get involved. So tonight's session is obviously structured as a panel discussion, followed by a brief question and answer session. We'll invite you to submit questions at any time during the presentation, and you can do that by entering them into the Slido box that you can see on your screen now. Your questions are only going to be visible to the council team, not to anyone else attending the webinar. And we don't think that we'll be able to get through all of them this evening, but we will respond to any unanswered questions by putting these and the recording from tonight onto our website, which you can see on your screen now. Okay, so now I'll hand over to our presenters. Kia ora.
Thank you. Kia ora koutou. Ko Pip Wheaton tōku ingoa. I'm the Principal Advisor for Climate Action at Wellington City Council. So climate change threatens the places, people and things that we love. Taking action is a way to care for them. I'm going to be talking about the causes of climate change, covering both the global context and what that looks like here in Wellington. However, it's important to acknowledge that while there's an element of this that's about science, climate change is a very human challenge rather than a technical one. In particular, it's a topic that can bring up feelings of grief, anger, frustration, despair. For me, bringing it back to care for the people and places that I love grounds me. We're all here tonight because we share a love for this city and we want to do all we can to protect this place from the threat of climate change. And it's not just us, the people in this room and all of you who've joined us for the conversation tonight. Wellingtonians care. We run a survey of a representative sample of the city's residents to understand their views on climate change. And each year we hear back that people are concerned and they want action. And so that's why we're here tonight. When it comes to climate change, there's consensus amongst scientists. Climate change is real, it's bad, and it's caused by humans. What this diagram represents is annual temperatures, showing how they're changing compared to 1850 to 1900. Blue patches represent cooler and red represent hotter. It shows back to 1900 and the black line around the middle is the year 2020. It shows that the average annual temperature is increasing. At the moment, the world is around 1.1 degrees Celsius hotter than 1850 to 1900. And while that might not sound like a lot, how it shows up is more hot days, hotter maximum temperatures, and increased probability of extreme weather like heat waves, droughts, and storms. We saw the impacts of that firsthand here in New Zealand earlier this year. And right now, we're living through the hottest July globally in 120,000 years. What we do now will impact future pathways. So that might sound bad, but the extent to which current and future generations will experience a hotter and different world depends on choices now and in the near term. We know what needs to happen. Climate change is caused by polluting greenhouse gases, which are things like methane and carbon dioxide, and they can come mainly from burning fossil fuels when we do everyday things like powering our homes and businesses or putting petrol and diesel in the vehicles that move people and things around. Those gases then get stuck in the atmosphere and are warming up the Earth. As long as the concentration of greenhouse gases is increasing, the warmer it's going to get. So to stop the planet from warming, we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and fast. And I'm not sure if this is maybe one scientific slide too many, but this graph shows the level of greenhouse gas emissions globally. The science is clear. We need to peak greenhouse gas emissions by 2025 and to rapidly reduce to approximately half by 2030, then reach net zero by 2050 and stay there. That's that green line, which shows you that the curve is pretty steep. So I said that the world knows what needs to happen, but we also know what needs to be done to get there. So how we reduce greenhouse gases is by phasing out fossil fuels and scaling back the resource intensity of our lifestyles. The challenge is that fossil fuels show up in many places, some of which aren't necessarily obvious. The IPCC, which is the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, summarised all of the research to distill 10 key solutions, which is what you see here. The solutions range from things like investing in clean energy and energy efficiency, increasing public transport, biking and walking, reducing food waste and eating more plants and less meat. But despite consensus, the world isn't moving fast enough. There's a gap between action and awareness. However, rather than this being a cause for fatalism, this is actually an invitation. We all have a role to play. So what is Wellington City Council doing? In 2019, Council declared a climate and ecological emergency, along with many other councils around the country. Te Tukura, First to Zero, is our commitment to achieving a net zero, climate resilient future. Te Tukura sets out the science-based target for the city, targets that are in line with the Paris Climate Agreement. What that means practically is that the city needs to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by 57% by 2030 and to reach net zero by 2050. That covers all of Wellington and all Wellingtonians. In addition, Council has set targets for ourselves as an organisation, covering all of our activities and the services that we deliver. We're also aiming for net zero by 2050, and we're in the process of setting an interim target in line with the city's target. But to reduce emissions, we need to know where they come from. So this chart shows that the activities with the biggest contribution to climate change for Wellington are how we move around the city. So that's the green part of this chart, as well as the energy that we use in our homes and businesses, which is shown here in yellow. So that's electricity and gas mainly. This graph is really useful, but it only shows us how the emission sources compare to each other. Pie graphs tell us nothing about trends. So here we have a graph that shows some good news. There's progress. Basically, our emissions are going down, that's the red line, even while our population is going up, that's the blue line. 9% reduction in greenhouse gases over the past 3 years, which is great, but there's still more to be done. There's lots of great stuff happening in the city, and there's more that we can each do, individually, collectively, and in shifting the system. At Wellington City Council, we're pulling the city-shaping levers to create more options for Wellingtonians to live lower carbon lives. Going back to this pie graph, it makes sense that our biggest investments are where there's biggest opportunity to reduce emissions and where there's other benefits to Wellingtonians. Through planning for growth, Wellingtonians have told us that they want to see the city densify around the city centre and around our town centres. and that's shaped our district plan. And that's great, because a dense city supports local businesses and communities to thrive, and also makes getting around by foot, bike, bus, skateboard so much easier and a truly accessible option. To enable that, we're investing in Let's Get Wellington Moving and the Bike Network Plan, which will remodel our streets and enhance the way we use them. This will provide the infrastructure needed to support more sustainable transport options. There will still be people who need to get around by car, and creating those other options gives them space to make that more accessible. Over time, those vehicles will become increasingly electric, and we're already seeing that happen now. And to encourage that, we're installing EV chargers around the city. All of this, combined with the district plan, will unlock a vibrant, dense, low-carbon city. This diagram gives a snapshot of some of our activities, and if you want more information, you can find them in Te Atakura on our website. So what does that mean for you and I as Wellingtonians? So as individuals, we also have levers to pull in our personal life. Research shows that one of the barriers to people acting is not knowing what has a meaningful impact, or not knowing where to start. A recent survey of New Zealanders showed that 40% rank recycling as the most impactful climate action. And while there are a whole lot of reasons why recycling is a good idea, it's way down the list for reducing emissions, coming in at 60th place. So looking at the city's biggest sources of emissions helps me figure out where I can have most impact as well. So the biggest opportunities fall into 4 categories: move, live, buy, and eat. Plus a bonus one, connect. Everyone has different lives and competing priorities, so what's possible for one person might not be possible for another. And so many people are already doing huge amounts to reduce their emissions. In my role, I often have people coming to me with their climate confessions, and while I try to live as lightly as possible, I'm far from perfect. So I find these categories really useful so that I can figure out where to put my attention. So for move, I still use a car when we travel as a family, but I ride to the office when I'm not working from home, and I feel like I'm winning because I'm avoiding the stresses of parking and traffic. For live, when my family moved to Wellington recently, we had the joys of house hunting. But some of the places that we looked at, I vetoed because they had gas connections rather than being heated by electricity. For buy, I spend way too much time on Trade Me, looking for secondhand scores. And for eat, while I love the weekend veggie markets, what you eat is far more important for the climate than where and how it's produced. So I'm working on reducing the amount of meat I eat. And connect is the underrated part. My impact is magnified when we connect with others. It's about talking to people about climate change so that each of us doesn't think that we're the only one who's worried. It's about letting us at council know what you care about, or linking up with others at your work to be climate champions. The point here is that we won't stop climate change by a small number of people living totally perfect, purest lives, but will make a huge difference if large numbers of people make imperfect changes. This is an everyone, everywhere, all at once challenge. We often hear about or hear arguments about whether it's individual action versus systemic change, but actually systems are made up of and shaped by individuals. We all play multiple roles in our lives, whether as citizens, friends, parents, consumers, employees, members of a community. Each of us has influences in the systems that we're part of, particularly when we act collectively. So while Wellington City Council, we're working on the city shaping levers, we're also supporting Wellingtonians to take action. My colleague Mark is going to talk more about that later, but for now I'm going to hand over to my colleague Kaeden, who will talk about climate change adaptation.
Tēnā koe Pip, tēnā tātou, ko Kaeden Watts tōku nua, heuria hau no Ngāti Tū Wharitō, Ngāti Mania Poto, Ngai Tūhoi Huki. A pleasure to be with you all. I am the Principal Engagement Advisor for Climate Change Adaptation at Wellington City Council. My section will cover reflections on climate impacts on the capital and what we can all do to come together to adapt, as well as reflecting on Te Ao Māori approaches and what we can learn from Māori and mana whenua as we navigate this space. I will reflect on perspectives from communities I've worked with, as well as focusing on the communities that we need to think about most as we adapt to climate change. Climate change is here, and we need to respond fast. While our primary prevention approach is to rapidly reduce emissions in Wellington via our ambitious net zero goals and emissions reduction plan, we also need to recognise that as a community, we may have some difficult but very important decisions for how to adapt to the unavoidable impacts. Just like emissions reduction, adaptation will require collective wisdom and efforts across the city, and we must work together as a community if we are to achieve this. Adaptation is also an opportunity to foster a better city, a better future for this city, one we want to hand on to future generations. We know that Wellingtonians expect council to recreate, transform the city to be climate resilient. Our approach is that a well-informed city, people working together across communities, excited about the future, motivated and inspired to contribute to a net zero carbon Wellington, specifically by supporting the structural changes, can make big differences, and we can do that together. As Pip mentioned, we look to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change for a lot of our research in this space. It is a collective of the world's most dedicated climate researchers, as has identified climate change as one of the most pressing issues of our time. I want to bring our attention to a quote from one of their reports. Unless there are immediate, rapid and large-scale reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, limiting emissions to 1.5 degrees will be beyond reach. A scary but well-researched warning about what damages could come if we don't start to act now. While the climate has always been something that we've had to adapt to, evidence tells us that human activity is causing us to adapt in a way that we have never had to before, and quickly. The graph on screen now shows us that yes, our climate has always had fluctuations in temperature, but human-induced contributions due to overproduction and overconsumption are forcing us to adapt in ways we have never had to before. Here we can see examples of what climate change practically looks like, what those temperature rises are doing all around Aotearoa, New Zealand, but also Wellington. Wellington faces many challenges with climate change: sea level rise, new extremes in weather, changing rainfall patterns, more flooding, more landslides, things that we're all familiar with now, all harmful and threatening impacts on our communities. And as I've said, Te Whanganui-a-Tara is already seeing these harmful impacts. On the left, you can see a large wave crashing onto the Ōwhiro Bay community during an extreme weather event, something the Ōwhiro Bay community is becoming well familiar with now as climate change impacts become more common and more extreme. And on the right, a damaged road, blocking off communities from being able to navigate and see each other, a sight very familiar to Wellingtonians at this point. Sea level rise is also a big issue for our harbour city, as evidenced here by the extreme tidal surges affecting vulnerable coastal communities. And here, another example of dry day flooding at Evans Bay, which is a familiar sight happening all around the city as well. Reclaimed land is an issue that we are having to face as well. In the last 200 years, people have dramatically changed the environment as the city has grown. We've drained swamp ecosystems and pipe streams, reclaimed the sea to create land in the central city and all across the city, which is causing issues for how water can drain out of the city. This is evidenced by the black lines in the green area representing land that has been reclaimed by our moana. Although we have tried to build outward to claim more land, the moana in the taiao is slowly starting to take that back. And this disadvantages certain groups more than others, as climate change will not affect us all equally. It is likely that low-income households, already disadvantaged communities, will be most impacted by climate change. Disadvantaged groups often have increased exposure to climate impacts and often have less access to protective economic and social factors like income to accommodate increasing living costs, retrofitting homes, and adequate insurance cover. And we need to ensure we do not leave these people behind as we continue to adapt. Tangata whenua, another group that have been disproportionately feeling the effects of climate change. Climate change impacts on tangata whenua will vary across the whenua, but it is likely that the impacts will be disproportionate. Climate change could have significant cultural impacts on iwi, hapu and Māori, potentially damaging marae, taonga species, wahi tapu, key sites of practices like mahi kai. Some iwi in the region are already undertaking significant work to understand and prepare for the impacts of climate change. And let's not forget our young people as well. Climate change is an intergenerational threat, and one of the major voices expressing their concern about the future is our young people who will inherit this issue. If we don't start acting with urgency, we will be leaving behind a drastically different world than what we found it. And right now, we do not have the structures in place to be bringing youth into the conversation like we should. It's our responsibility as organisations, decision makers, to ensure that this conversation is readily accessible to everybody. Could I ask the team to move to the next slide, please? And so what does this all mean? I know that the issue can seem scary and overwhelming, but it does not have to be this way. We can adapt and we can plan and we can come out of this stronger and better connected as a result. And we don't have to look too far into the past to see how this can be done. I want to bring our attention to a whakatauki that speaks to me when I think about climate change as an issue. Kia whakatō muri te haere whakamua. I walk backwards into the future with my eyes fixed on the past. We do not need to look too far back to see a template for how climate change adaptation can be done. Māori have been doing this for years, have been adapting with the climate, living with the climate and building relationships with te taiao for many centuries before climate change became an issue. And the first step in us understanding how we adapt is to understand our relationship with nature, with te taiao. It's important that we understand that we are not independent of our environment and that the environment and climate is not here to serve us. We can't control the environment and climate, and how we choose to approach our relationship with the environment in the long term will only affect us. The whenua will live on, te taiao will live on, and it will heal, it will recover, with or without us. Before the influence of colonisation, capitalism, overconsumption, Māori had a deep, intrinsic understanding of their environments and all the subtle and extreme changes that came with it. Whether that be an understanding of the reproduction of kai moana in local awa or the growing patterns of kai amongst changing seasons, Māori identified the changing patterns of our climate and adapted with them. Now patterns are not so easily identifiable, but these understandings and learnings have not been lost. These knowledges are held by our mana whenua of the Wellington region, and if our communities are willing to be led by the knowledge and the guidance of mana whenua and those Māori communities, we have a template and a way forward for how we can approach climate change and climate action. Wellington City Council is trying to do this right now, and I want to mihi to Mataho Aronui, our Māori Partnerships and Strategy team, for the incredible work they have done in this space, for partnering with mana whenua in a way that works for all mana whenua as well as Wellington City Council. On the screen here you can see Tākai here, our mana whenua partnerships agreement between Taranaki Whānui ki te Upoko te Ika, te Rūnanganui o te Aotearoa and te Rūnanga o Toa Rangatira, as well as Wellington City Council. This document acts as a template for how we will approach partnership as well in relation to mana whenua, as well as Tūpiki Ora, our Māori strategy, which operationalises what that relationship can look like and the key focus areas, one of which is climate change and climate adaptation. And adaptation is already happening in big and small ways across the city, and there are communities that are actioning climate change right now. As I mentioned before, Ngāti Toa Rangatira recently developed their taiao strategy, of which climate change and climate adaptation was included as a key focus area. 4C, which stands for Coastal Communities and Climate Change, an incredible organising effort by communities across Wellington, sharing resources and knowledge to plan for climate action. and Makata Beach community who developed the Makata Beach Community Adaptation Plan, a community-led adaptation plan which acts as a template for how community-led climate action can be done. And this is just a handful of the many amazing community efforts that are happening all across the city, many of which Mark will touch on shortly. And so there are 4 key places where Council is aiming to support the city to adapt. Number 1, building the evidence base of climate change risks and impacts. This is so we can understand where attention is most needed, so we can adequately plan what to do next. And this must be informed by communities. A citywide adaptation approach and plan, as well as supporting communities to develop their own adaptation plans. And then finally, advocating central government on what we believe is needed in climate adaptation, a role that we have been playing ever since the National Adaptation Plan was first released, and a role we will continue to play. Adaptation is complex. It's a complex challenge, and Council has a lot of data, but we don't have all the answers. Adaptation will be a collective effort. It will be ongoing as our environment and city changes long term. Climate resilience is a major priority for the Council because this reflects the expectations from the community. Council is prioritising adaptation planning for the city's infrastructure and assets, as well as in the new Community Climate Adaptation Program that will be rolled out over the next few years. For both citywide and local neighbourhood planning, that happens in streets and in neighbourhoods, and there are 5 core steps that we can identify for how this can be done. Number 1 is understanding what is happening, and that's understanding what is happening in Wellington communities with a conversation and partnership with Wellington communities. We need to understand communities' lived experiences and the urgency that they feel in their day-to-day lives in relation to climate change. Next, understanding what matters most, continuing that conversation deeper. Third, what can we do about that? And then we can move on to the 4th step and develop a plan to action that. Once we have our plan, we'll implement the 5th step, which is implementing that plan, monitoring, and continuing to refine and change as needed. To help us as a community, in the coming months, you'll see Council lead a range of projects within the city that aim to better understand and communicate climate change impacts, and to collectively work through how to adapt and reduce emissions together as a community. Some examples include new information on climate change impacts, co-design opportunities for new digital and in-person activities, and support to community groups and individuals, mana whenua, and the community generally. And in exciting news, we are the recipients of the Bloomberg Global Mayors Challenge for our innovative approach to using technology and engaging communities to adapt to climate change in Te Whanganui-a-Tara. We've been lucky to have over 140 Wellingtonians engaged on the Digital Twin Community Climate Adaptation Project and input into the design of this tool to date, and are looking forward to continuing engagement in the near future. So to follow on from what my friend Pip has said here, reducing emissions is important, and we need to pair that with adapting to the impacts of climate change, as those two go hand in hand. Every fraction of a degree of warming averted reduces the impacts of warming, making our work to adapt easier. Given that we are surpassing tipping points in the climate system where many impacts are largely baked in until 2050, we must now adapt to the unavoidable impacts. Adaptation activities should also support emissions reduction goals / sustainability goals long term in order to avoid unsustainable adaptation options. There are things we can do now that benefit emissions reduction and adaptation, and wider imbalance with te taio, including nature-based solutions and making changes at home. Collective action and collaboration is vital. We want to support communities to lead their own change and involve communities in shaping the future of the city. I'm now going to pass to my friend Mark to continue this kōrero. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Kaeden. So as Lexi said, I'm the community team lead, and our team roughly is the community development team for the city, and we also manage a range of community centers across the city. So one of the key things to think about with Wellington is that communities are taking action in Wellington. And so there are people all around you who you can join in order to kind of have an impact on climate. So it's not too late. So the key way that community is taking action is together. Individual action is individual, it's small, but by actually joining other people, you multiply your impact. Community groups are coming together to reconnect with the joy of growing, foraging, cooking, caring for soil, spending time with each other, building a stronger bond to the earth and to their local environment. Organizations like Seeds to Feeds and our range of community gardens across the city, our high security organizations, the Wellington Time Bank, Kibosh, Everybody Eats, cycling action groups, and even down to walking school buses that are part of all of our schools around the city are key parts of how communities are taking action. Wellingtonians are coming together to change how they move, live, buy, eat, and connect. And that last one is key because it's us doing everything together that actually makes a difference. So I'm going to go through a range of ways that Wellingtonians are taking action. And this isn't an exhaustive list by far. It's just a set of examples. So one example is how community groups come together and they reuse resources in the area. So gaining back control over how we buy and consume is a key part of where communities are taking action. We've reached a fever pitch of disposability in our pursuit of convenience. And communities are finding ways to reuse resources that open up many things across income scales. It opens up skills. It gives people a sense of valuing each other and valuing the things that they buy in order to kind of hold on to them longer and make them last. So one project that's doing this with wood is Bench Space. So it's a group of passionate woodworkers who have come together around a collective purpose of reusing wood that would normally go to landfill. So they're taking waste wood that is produced from a wide variety of sources across the city, and they're turning that into community assets through furniture, through kind of other tools that communities can then use to benefit their lives. And throughout that process, they're teaching the skills of woodworking. They're teaching the joy of creating things out of a resource that would have otherwise gone to landfill. Another example is the quarterly repair cafes that organizations like Sustainability Trust and Hopper Refillery run. And these are opportunities where they bring together a range of people who specialize in repairing a wide variety of things, and they teach people how those things can be repaired. So this is a way that communities come together to learn the skills to make their valuable things last longer. Another area is communities learn better together. So people all across Wellington have a wide variety of skills that they can share that are part of that puzzle on how we can adapt and respond and reduce our impact on climate. So part of it is accessing those resources through our range of libraries, but then the other aspect is actually teaching each other those skills. So we have people who have practiced a trade throughout their life, who have learned really valuable skills that allow other people to do things that reduce their impact on the climate around them. Our range of community centers and libraries are key places where people come together to learn from each other, to share skills, to encounter things that they didn't know were possible. and pardon me, programs like our Zero Together program are ways that communities come together to learn in a peer learning environment where they can tell each other how they are having an impact on climate, and then how they can take action together and support each other while doing it. Another area is food waste and regenerating soil. This is a hot topic issue because food waste is disgusting in a personal kind of sense, but it also creates an enormous amount of waste that goes to landfill and creates all kinds of systemic problems there. It creates quite a lot of emissions, and dealing with it at a local level all of a sudden starts to mitigate a whole bunch of effects on our climate. But one of the really special things is how we actually turn that food waste into something useful. So organizations like Kibosh Food Rescue are taking food waste from grocery stores and supermarkets that would normally have gone to waste, that isn't quite good enough to kind of sell at the standards that they sell at, but is still perfectly usable, is still perfectly safe, and is full of nutrients that would otherwise go to landfill. They're taking that and they're packaging it up into kind of a nutrient-dense box, and then they're sharing that with people who would normally have trouble accessing fresh, healthy food. That effort is built on the backs of volunteers. So Wellingtonians across the city are helping with this effort to take food that would normally go to waste and sharing it with people who need that food. You can see on the slide here, they've managed to redirect food that encompasses over 2 million meals just this last year. That is an incredible impact that your neighbors all around you are taking action on. Another project that's quite special is the Free Store. They're going around cafes around Wellington that would normally have to get rid of food at the end of the day, and they're gathering that up and they're taking it back, and they're creating community out of it for people who have been disconnected or marginalized in society. So this food that would normally go to waste is now creating connection and creating pathways for people to actually feel a part of our society. Communities are also actively involved in community composting. So composting hubs are starting to spring up around the city. We're trialing a city program that is being hosted by a number of community groups. There are a number of community gardens around the city that are engaged in composting. And we have organizations like KaiCycle who are gathering up food waste from households all over Wellington. What the really special thing that's happening here is that all of these groups are taking food that would they're taking food scraps that would normally contribute to emissions, and they're turning that back into highly productive soil. So this regenerates the soil in these places where community compost is happening, or community gardening is happening, and it's creating fresh, healthy food right in the neighborhoods that need it. This is a pretty special cycle because it reduces kind of the distances that food has to travel. It gives people something really powerful to engage in. You know, they're able to kind of connect with the earth. They're able to connect with each other. They're able to connect with their food in a really visceral way. And we want to kind of see this effort grow. Organizations like KaiCycle are starting to do this on a really large scale and hoping to kind of continue that in the future. And so for those who don't know, this is a community farm that is actually right in the middle of the city on Hospital Road. So Another way that communities are doing this is they're eating more consciously. They're growing food together, and then they're turning that whatever's left over back into that process. So it tightens these cycles. A key, food is something that binds us all together. Food carries a lot of memories. Food is a way that we share key parts of our identities with other people. And food is a way that we convey comfort and belonging to each other. So communities sharing food and skills is a key way that they tap into these really visceral parts of their humanity. But it's also a way that they really take action together to kind of reduce their impact. Growing things together, learning about how to produce vegetables, reducing reliance on meat, learning skills to cook unfamiliar vegetables. These are all ways that people are actually actively taking action, teaching each other these skills, and benefiting the communities around them. So projects like Seeds to Feeds really provide a good scaffold around this. So for those who don't know, this is a local food festival that happens here in Wellington, and it goes for the entire year. They gather food, they forage, they turn this food into kind of preserves, then they wrap it into these lovely food festivals, community feasts where they celebrate all of this food and bounty. Another example is the Newtown Tool Bank that provides a space for a wide variety of tools for those who don't have that storage at home. This is a community initiative. People believed in this and they put it together. And now it provides kind of a whole range of specialist tools that people wouldn't otherwise have access to. Lastly, communities have a key role in advocacy. Communities have a wide range of things that they believe in, and when they find other people who believe in those things, they're able to kind of push and show what their priorities are. And so where people are concerned about climate, there is a key role for community to advocate for climate action. Again, doing this alone is really hard, but as groups grow, their voice grows, and so you can actually tell organizations and places that hold power what changes you want to see. Communities are doing this around taking action on cycling, taking action on community gardening, and a wide variety of other ways. They do this through volunteering their efforts. So much of what communities are doing is outside of council. Groups rise up for what they care and believe in, and people teach each other how to engage in these key skills that are vital in having a positive impact on climate. So thinking about how council supports this process, we support through space for community ideas, through that range of community centers, through our libraries, through spaces for people to gather and share and engage in these activities. We provide funding through our Social and Recreation Fund, our Waste Minimization Fund, and a wide variety of other funds. But we also provide knowledge about what other funding is out there, both through our funding team as well as through the library funding portal that you can find on the Wellington City Council library site. We provide advice and capacity building for people. And we connect people with community groups who are doing amazing work around the city and need Wellingtonians to take part. So, thinking about what you can do, check out your local community spaces, sign up for a Zero Together workshop, go to trainings with the Sustainability Trust, go to workshops at your local gardens, take part in projects like Bench Space or the Tool Bank, tap into the funds that are available through our city funds or that you can find through that library portal. Join Predator Free, get involved in kind of local conservation groups in your area. Take part in Seeds to Feeds, or get a bike buddy, or organize a walking group for school children in your area. So many of these groups really rely on volunteers, and so your volunteer effort is what makes these things hum and what gives all of these efforts more strength and more voice in order to kind of respond to climate change. So I wanted to just end on, there's also a global community of knowledge and skills around places like Shareable, where they have gathered together 300 guides on how communities take action to improve their lives and reduce their impact on climate. And that's just one of many examples all over the world that we're able to tap into and that can inspire communities here in Wellington. So individuals band together and individual actions are transformed when taken collectively, and that's what communities do together. And so think about, if not now, when will you take action? If not you, then who will take action, and who will they take action with? So, kia ora.
Kia ora whanau, that was so good. I often feel really anxious talking about climate change, but I find that really inspiring and really beautiful and really hopeful. Some of the threads that I kind of picked up on were around like care and collective wisdom and partnership with Wellington communities and all taking action together. That was really nice. We have heaps of questions. So just a quick reminder, if you do want to ask a question, then you can submit it through your Slido box on your screen. But we'll get into it. So this one's for you, Pip. This is a hugely important presentation. And this person's wondering if the conversation will be taken into face-to-face engagements in libraries and community spaces, businesses, residents associations, all over the place, and whether this recording will be shared widely.
I love that question. Yes, that is absolutely the intention. So this is meant to be launching the climate conversations, and our hope is to essentially go where there is energy. So if whoever is asking this question would like to actually host a conversation like this, please get in touch. But we will be reaching out to groups and should be also hopefully having some physical pop-up spaces over the next year or so. Oh, and yes, we will be sharing the recording as well.
Mark, it's awesome to hear about awesome work being done by community groups, and interesting to hear that there are so many of these. Does Council provide any support to ensure that groups can function in a high cost of living society?
That's a very good question, and that's a key concern in Wellington, considering living costs here. There are two parts of the answer. One is that Wellington City Council tries to top up the funding that groups apply for around a cost of living fund. So we have a commitment to the living wage. And so we try and make sure that where funding is covering wages, for instance, that those wages are being provided at a living wage rate. The other part to the answer is that not all of these community actions need to be funded. And so to a certain extent, some communities don't wait for the funding. They just go ahead and do it. And so while I guess that diversity is really key, so where communities see an opportunity, they take action together, and they're able to kind of do pretty amazing things. And then there are other initiatives that should be funded and are able to tap into kind of those living wage funds. So.
I want to take an opportunity to also give a bit of a plug. There is the Climate and Sustainability Fund that is open at the moment, with applications closing on the 10th of August. So if you do have a project that you are interested in getting funded, then please check that out. That's on our website. And we're in particular looking for projects that have significant emissions reductions associated with them, and projects that are Māori-led. But there is a global challenge of not enough funding being directed to climate change. So we're really excited that we've got this fund within Wellington City Council.
Kaeden, this one's for you. When's the digital twin project that you mentioned going to be released to the public?
Yes, I'm glad you asked. So to answer your question, it's anticipated that the digital twin will be released to the public next year. But that's not to say you'll have to wait that long before you see it. Engagement on that is happening right now and will continue to happen very soon. And long term, we're hoping that the inputs from communities that we're engaging with will, continue to refine and develop the digital twin, so it's an amazing adaptation tool for all communities in Wellington.
Oh, this one's so nice. So Pip, does Wellington City Council have any active relationships with communities internationally, and have any exciting stories of togetherness come from that?
That's nice. I think there's a lot of informal learning that happens internationally. I know that one of the teams recently won a prize. The city design team won a prize that had them going over to London to learn about what's going on in different parts of the world. A whole bunch of people came together, and they came back so inspired and with so many different things that we could be applying. I know that our team also has lots of connections with other communities that are doing things in really grassroots ways. In particular with a few in the UK that are really sort of, I think, at the cutting edge of what truly participatory city creation looks like.
Awesome.
And I might jump in on that. Wellington City Council is also part of the Milan Food Pact. Mm-hmm. And so that's a network of cities all around the world who are trying to change their local food systems and trying to kind of adapt them to be more sustainable and more responsive to people's needs. So.
This one maybe also for you, Mark. Why aren't funders funding enough climate action initiatives? And is there a framework to understand impact metrics for climate action initiatives?
I can touch on it a little bit. So we are one of a number of funders, and local funders here in the region do meet up regularly. And so there is an increasing amount of coordination between funders in order to respond to those needs. I'm not sure how much funding is actually being applied towards understanding impact metrics necessarily, but there is definitely a significant pressure on funders to coordinate so that where one funder may not have enough funds to dedicate towards initiatives, collectively they can direct funds to appropriately support them. So.
Kaeden, what are some of the key differences in how changes in the environment are perceived in Te Ao Māori in comparison to from a kind of Western science lens?
It's a really interesting question, and I think I would more frame it as because the end result is the same. We, in Western science and Te Ao Māori Indigenous knowledges, and I've had the pleasure of connecting with Indigenous communities all across the world who share very similar whakaaro that we do in our relationship to the environment and how we treat the environment. There is a same end result between Indigenous knowledges that I have had the pleasure of learning from and Western science, that the climate is being harmed and the climate needs to be protected, and we need to change our behaviour in order to sustain it. that end result, that perception of the changing climate is the same between the two. It's how we get there that is different. And so my main thought goes to the relationship that we have with the environment, and that personification of the environment, living in harmony with the environment, that is somewhat absent from Western science, at least in my experiences of what I've read and what I've engaged with. Māori relationships with the environment are intrinsic. It's deep. It's knowing your whenua and the changes and what's missing 100 years ago that you know because of passed down knowledge, and what species are no longer there, what kai you no longer have access to, whether that be because those species have moved away, or because they no longer have a home, or whatever it may be. All of that to say, it's understanding that we're in relationship with the environment, and that you need to have that intrinsic deep understanding of your local whenua. And I feel that lens is somewhat absent from Western science, and how that climate change is communicated through Western science. So I think if Western science perhaps encompass that view of personifying the environment and our relationship with it more, maybe this issue could be a lot less overwhelming and daunting to understand and action. Kia ora.
Well, okay, in response to that, maybe to everyone, we have a couple of partai that are probably for everyone. Should we be panicking when it comes to climate change and the minimal time that we actually have to take drastic action? And this person says, I think there's concern of not worrying people, but will people take drastic action if they aren't aware of the severity?
I'm happy to jump on that one. So I'm going to speak to the second part first. So I do think there's concern about not worrying people, and I think it's sort of misplaced. What we know about how humans relate to information about essentially existential threat is that if they feel like it's not a problem, then there's no need to take action. And so artificially, minimizing the way that we're talking about things doesn't help, because then people don't understand the severity. So I think that's absolutely right. But also, if people think that it's too much of an issue and that they're too small and that there's nothing that they can do about it, they also won't take action.
Yeah.
So it's there's a lot of thinking, and some of the leading thinking globally is being done by groups here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. The Workshop, for example, have done great research on how to communicate about climate change effectively, so that you help people see their own agency in it and help them see the way that they can actually have an impact. Because if you don't believe that your action is going to create change, or if you don't believe that change is possible, then of course you don't feel like you've got agency.
Yeah, tautoko, completely tautoko. Will we act if we're not confronting the severity of it? My thought is no. And we've done a very good job at that so far, of distancing ourselves from the problem. I think most of us probably don't know where our food comes from, or choose to actively distance themselves from that understanding, because it is easier to just push that to the back of your mind. It's once we start confronting where our food comes from, what's happening to our different species, our native species across Aotearoa, everything, what's happening to your whenua, what's happening to Aotearoa. Once we start to confront that conversation is when changes and radical changes actually start to happen. And so if we're complacent with, and okay with how things are at the moment, no action won't be taken. And so I urge people to have those conversations now. But I also urge you to not necessarily take the overwhelming negative frame, because it doesn't have to be that way. We can emerge from this with really positive things. And if I was to take the example I used before, our relationship with Te Taiao as an example, here's an opportunity for radical change that does that grows our relationship with the environment, where we know where the food comes from, where we know who's in our communities. You can build a stronger, more resilient set of communities through radically rethinking what Aotearoa looks like. And a key step in systems change as a part of that is confronting climate change and all of its holistic impacts.
I might also chuck in there that, again, communities take action together, and so they don't really take action until they're scared. And it is scary and it's big, but people together they can also be pretty big, Individuals don't have much of a voice, but large groups of people do. And they determine kind of the direction that society goes in. And so it's fundamentally about, like, is it something that you care about? Is it something that you will talk to your neighbors about? Is it something that will drive your interactions with other people in order to find how decisions are made and what affects the things that you're able to do in order to take action on climate change? And if you're willing to take that action, take it with other people, because that way you won't burn out. And that way you'll have friends and allies and people who will support you in doing that. And when you get tired, they'll take up the baton, So do it together.
Heaps of pātai around funding. Will the council be set up in the future to continue funding community mahi, as discussion around budgets are common and budgets may shift due to disaster recovery? Maybe that's one for you, Mark. Maybe Pip.
Maybe me. The Climate and Sustainability Fund is funded for the next 3 years. It will have been 5 years in total. So absolutely, we are set up to be continuing to fund communities to take climate action, and hopefully even beyond that.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome.
And I can also touch on it. I guess council funding, like, it's not the end all and be all. Like, it is there to provide support for communities to do things that are important to them, that benefit their communities, that allow them to do things that they wouldn't normally be able to do. But it is it's not a huge amount of money when you actually kind of look at everything that goes around in society and stuff. And so we often look at it as ways to get things started, ways to get ideas up and off the ground, or to support the really key priorities that the city has around how we work with youth, or programs that are really kind of important to Wellingtonians at a particular moment in time. But tying into kind of other sources of funding across the country, across the region, that's really kind of where the magic happens. You're able to kind of like tie into kind of these other sources to make things happen. And then looking at being pretty creative, because we're going into kind of a period of budgetary tightening as we're dealing with a lot of these kind of systemic issues and addressing problems that we weren't sure were problems, or now realize are. So kind of being pretty clever with what we do have is going to be pretty necessary over the next few years. And that's really kind of where collective action comes in again, is, when we're stretched resource-wise, when we tie into kind of the skills and resources of kind of all of those communities around us, we're able to kind of do a lot more than we would otherwise be able to do.
Does anyone have any thoughts on or comments on the politicisation of climate change, given the kind of politics of local government, potential for changes in governing bodies as we face climate change?
I think one thing we could probably all agree on is that climate change is an ongoing crisis. It's a crisis that science and evidence tells us is going to be present for a really long time unless we act. And so I think that narrative has remained constant in our observations of the importance of climate change and the importance of acting. And I think the key thing here is that we're listening to the communities that we're here to serve. And what we're hearing is climate change is something that communities want to take action on. And so, from what we can see, that narrative is strong.
Yeah, I think maybe the thing I'd add is even when we're not necessarily explicitly hearing people talk about climate change, there are so many places where issues intersect that I think, when we're talking about things like jobs, when we're talking about things like equity, when we're talking about things like housing, all of those have a climate aspect to them. So it's recognising how we can make sure that we're not letting this become a polarising issue, but more of an opportunity to do sort of what Kaeden was talking about earlier, of like striving towards the future that we all want while also addressing climate change.
Yeah, so speaking of the future that we all want, probably also for all of you, what's the best way for schools to engage with council in the citywide climate response? And are there any examples of school or student involvement in climate change response?
Yeah, we are doing, our behaviour change team is doing a lot of work with schools supporting active transport. And so if schools want to get involved, again, please feel free to reach out. Also, we've been doing some work with different groups working with young people, so not specific schools, but across multiple schools, and seeing a real curiosity and hunger for an avenue to talk about these issues, because I think that it is something that young people obviously feel quite heavily. And so having the space to engage with those emotions and to be able to channel them into action is something really powerful.
I may also just jump in on that. I guess there are two aspects. Schools do what they're funded for, and they do a lot more on top of that, off the backs of very passionate and talented teachers who take on a lot of load that's over and above their jobs. And that contributes to children's understanding of these issues. It contributes to their understanding of what action they can take, but it's bonus. And so if you want to see action taken in schools, there's also a place for putting pressure on government to change priorities for the school system. So that's one aspect of it. And then the other aspect is that parent communities actually have a pretty significant role in schools through PTAs and through determining some of the priorities that they want to see for their kids. So actually actively getting involved in the local school community is a key way that Wellingtonians can contribute to what options are available for their children and how their children learn about these issues and take action. So.
Hey Mark, what's happening with the setting up a roadside food collection? It would have had a big impact on emissions reduction, but there's been radio silence since the limited trial was completed.
So I'm just going to acknowledge that I don't know a whole lot about this, and because that's a systems level response that council could take. It's one of a number of options, but it's in our waste management arm. So that's a completely separate part of council from myself. But it's something that we can respond to through the follow-ups from this. But there is information available on our website and through advisors who work specifically in those areas. So.
Yeah, I think if you check out our zero waste strategy that was adopted very recently, there's an update in there about that.
Yeah, I guess one of the things that I will add is that community composting hubs don't necessarily stand in place of municipal composting or curbside or any of that. All of these things have I guess, trade-offs. And I guess one of the trade-offs around people just putting food waste out on the curbside is that they don't see that really tight cycle of what happens to it and how to deal with it and what the impact of it is. That food waste can have a really positive impact, or it can just go into the landfill. So it really matters quite heavily, like what we actually do with it. And so communities actually banding together and engaging in composting activities, for instance, is a pretty powerful way of capturing that resource and turning it back into productive soils.
So community initiatives are great, but they don't seem to tackle the systemic issues that cause climate change. Participatory democracy seems to be working in many places. What's being done to address systemic issues and redistribution of power at council? I feel like any of you could talk about that.
I feel like you could talk about that.
Shall we do?
Yeah.
Okay. So we're doing lots in that space. I would probably flip it more to deliberative democracy rather than participatory democracy, which is generally kind of a representative sample of humans getting together and then us systemically breaking down barriers to their participation, because we know that we have not historically been particularly good at reaching historically marginalised communities. We are just about to launch a pilot of Citizens Assembly, so invitations will have gone out to about 10,000 Wellingtonians in the last couple of days. We've already had an awesome response, and it's really cool to see people being like really keen to change in that space. So lots of really interesting work happening, and we kind of know that we're taking small incremental steps to continuously improve our engagement with the community, but we feel like a kind of more participatory and deliberative democracy approach can really create a huge step change. Last question time. Okay, cool. So just a reminder though that we also, if we don't get to your question, we will answer it, and it'll be on our website whenever this recording goes up. So lots and lots of interest in our public transport infrastructure. Are there any plans to deal with driver shortages or plans for electric public transport? And what role does council play in our public transport system? For you, Pip?
Great. I'm really glad that there's lots of interest in that, given that transport is nearly 50% of our emissions. Wellington City Council plays a big role in our transport system. We are Greater Wellington, the regional council is responsible for the majority of it though, so we partner with them. In particular, they're responsible for the bus services, and I know that they've done incredible work to be recruiting more drivers to make sure that the pay is better and that there is more reliability. The good thing is that in terms of the percentage of people catching buses, we're starting from a really good base. So in Wellington, it's around 20% of people commute to work on bus. So it's already really strong. And with things like Let's Get Wellington Moving, which we're partnering on, there's an opportunity, like a once in a lifetime opportunity, to be doing much more.
That's all we have time for this evening. Huge thanks to all of our presenters and to everyone at home. So we'll post the questions on our website along with the recording of this event. I'll now close with a karakia. Kia tau, kia tātou katoa, te aio, te aroha me te maru tau. Tihei Māori ora. Kia ora.